So welcome to this conversation with Jorge Ramos. My name is Matthew Powers, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington. And I'm also the co-director of the newly relaunched Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy, which is very proud to host or to co-host today's event. The center's aim is to advance understanding of the role that journalism and media play in democratic societies around the world. And this is work that we try to accomplish in part through dialogue with distinguished journalists and in collaboration with colleagues at partner institutions. And so to that end, we're thrilled to be speaking today with one of the leading voices in journalism and to be doing so in collaboration with colleagues at Iberoamericana in Mexico. Before turning it over to my colleague and friend Sandra Vera-Zambrano to introduce Jorge and to get the conversation started, I'll just make two brief programming notes. And the first is that if you have questions, that's great. Please use the chat box to write in those questions. You can write them in English or Spanish. And Sandra and I will monitor these questions and do our best to work them in throughout the conversation. And just please try and keep your questions brief so that we can include as many as possible throughout our hour together. The second item is that today's event is the first of three that we'll be doing through the center this week, dealing with media and the US elections. So tomorrow, Tuesday at noon, Seattle time, our colleague at the University of Washington, Patricia Moy, will host a virtual conversation about public opinion and polls in the 2020 election. And on Wednesday at noon, center-affiliated faculty Adrian Russell, Lance Bennett, and myself will have a public conversation about media and politics in the run-up to the election. Both information and registration about all those events are available at the Department of Communication website for the University of Washington. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Sandra, who will introduce Jorge.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you very much, the University of Washington and the Center for doing this possible. Also, many thanks to all the staff in the Departamento de Comunicación en la Ibero, in particular, the head of the department, Dr. Manuel Alejandro Guerrero, Dr. Julia Palacios, Dr. Sergio Rodríguez, y muy en particular, todo mi agradecimiento, nuestro agradecimiento a la doctora Marimar Sanz, gracias a quien esto fue posible. Sin ella, nada de esto podría suceder hoy. Entonces, bueno, primero todos estos agradecimientos a todo el staff, a todos los alumnos, and then I'll just switch into English just to present Jorge Ramos, who really needs no presentation. He's one of the greatest journalists Mexican history has seen, and they better because he's an alumni from there, and also because he really deeply represents Latino community in the US, and that's very difficult, and God knows that's very difficult. So just very briefly say that he's won many prizes, and also he's been working for Univision for the last 30 years, more than that, and that he also writes books. We can find many from stories for children until his positions as an immigrant, as a journalist, or other books that are ready to come, so just be aware of that. That's always a pleasure to read something coming from Jorge Ramos, and who's someone who's very active, well, in the media, not only in Univision, but only for the New York Times. His blogs, his Twitters, they are very known. So I'll just kick off with a very particular question, and which is related to what we're doing here now, and bringing Mexicans and Americans and people all around the world to this conversation and focusing on journalism and American elections. And so my question would be, as good neighbors, Mexican always care about American elections. But why should we care about this election in particular? What about Trump or Biden that we should be particularly interested in as Mexicans?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, all of you, for inviting me for this conversation. Let me just first put it in perspective. We're going to be having an election on November the 3rd. And it's such an important election that is going to define the future of democracy in the United States. But we have to be very careful because you've seen the polls and I've seen the polls. They say that Donald Trump is behind 10 10 points from Joe Biden, but I was doing my homework, and on October 26, 2016, Donald Trump was behind 14 points. And we know exactly what happened. So we have to be, as journalists, we have to be very careful with the polls, and with this element of the shy Trumpers, gente que apoya Donald Trump, people who support Donald Trump, but they don't feel comfortable saying that to the pollsters, and they don't feel comfortable saying that to journalists. Where I work at Univision, when you come in Miami, if you go to the right, you see the 3 or 4 radio stations. And if you go to the left, you see the local station and the network. Well, I go through the radio station every time when I go to Univision. And in 2016, I made a mistake. I was listening all the time on radio shows, people saying, I'm going to be voting for Donald Trump. Of course, we couldn't see their faces, but they were saying, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I was saying, well, maybe it has to do with the Cuban American community, with the new Venezuelans coming in, people from Central America. And we just didn't pay enough attention to that. At the end, more than 3 million Latinos, just imagine that, more than 3 million Latinos voted for Donald Trump, despite the fact that Donald Trump had accused Mexican immigrants of being criminals and rapists, despite the fact that he stopped the traditional asylum process in the United States, and that thousands of Central Americans are waiting on the Mexican side right now. And going directly to your question, Sandra, I know that Donald Trump and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they have had what seems to be a pretty good relationship. The truth is that Mexico and the Mexican president have done everything that Donald Trump have wanted. And Mexico has become the wall between thousands of migrants from Central America coming to the United States. So the question is if the relationship between López Obrador and Donald Trump are going to continue to be as good as it is right now, or if with Joe Biden, things are going to be changing. What we know, and then we can get into that a little later, but what we know is that the policy that Joe Biden is going to have with immigration is going to be completely different than the one Donald Trump has. Joe Biden has promised that he would introduce immigration reform to Congress in the first 100 days. He has promised that he would legalize again the Dreamers, more than 700,000 undocumented students, and that he's going to give TPS, or temporary protection, to Venezuelans in this country. So the policy that Joe Trump might have towards Mexico and towards immigration is going to be completely different than the one we've had with Donald Trump.
And Jorge, to sort of follow up on that, you have this really unique sort of ability to occupy prominent positions both in English and Spanish language media. And so you are the nightly news anchor on Univision, but you also are, you wrote just this past month a very moving editorial for the New York Times about not being able to get back to Mexico City to see your mother for her birthday. And I'm wondering, what differences do you see in the way this U.S. election in particular gets discussed across both of these different range of media?
Well, for Latinos, when I first arrived in the United States, there were about 15 million Latinos, and I have been surfing that wave. And right now we're more than 60 million Latinos, and it's going to continue going forward. And what we are seeing right now in the United States is an incredible demographic revolution. From 60 million, we'll go to about 100 million Latinos in less than 3 decades. And in 2044, and I certainly hope to be here, Matt, but in 2044, everyone is going to be a minority in the United States. So that's exactly what we are seeing. It's a country in which minorities will become the majority. And it is a country in which the president, Donald Trump, is trying to resist that change. He's refusing to see that America does not have a white face anymore. In the 1940s, in the 1950s, almost 80 or 90% of population was non-Hispanic white. Not anymore. That's not the case anymore. So the way we discuss all these issues have to do a lot with racism and discrimination. We have the most anti-immigrant president that we have since the 1950s, when Operation Wetback, when more than 1 million Mexicans were deported to Mexico with President Eisenhower. And when we talk about Donald Trump, on many occasions, it's on the issue of racism. Here we have a president that openly has stated, that openly has made racist comments. When he said that Mexican immigrants were criminals and rapists, that's a racist statement. When he said that Kamala Harris was a monster, that's a sexist and a racist statement. When he said that Judge Gonzalo Curiel, for instance, that he couldn't do his job simply because of his Mexican heritage, that's a racist statement. So I think that for Latinos and for Mexican Americans and for those who came from Latin America, that's a perspective that we simply cannot forget. This is not normal. It is not normal that from the White House, you have someone who's made sexist remarks, who's made racist remarks. It is not normal that the president has lied more than 20,000 times, according to the Washington Post. So these are not normal times in the United States. And unfortunately, many people didn't pay attention to that. When he ejected me from a press conference in August in 2015, we said, hey, look, this is not normal. It is not normal that the president or a future president or that a candidate can eject you with a bodyguard from a press conference. That's exactly what Fidel Castro did to me in Guadalajara many, many years ago. So, and people were saying, well, you know, you're too sensitive. You don't know exactly who Donald Trump is. Nothing's going to happen. He's not going to win. And here we are 4 or 5 years later telling you, we told you so.
And so in that vein of what you're saying, there's a question from a GQ journalist, Carlos Vasquez, who's somewhere there, and he asks, and I just read it so that you have it as well, can a journalist be an activist? And this is all because of your standing position.
Well, one way to attack a journalist because of the questions that you made is to tell you, no, you're not a journalist, you're an activist. And I think it's a great debate. I'm not an activist. I'm just a journalist who asks questions. But part of our social responsibility is to challenge and to question those who are in power. We've discussed that in the past, Matt and Sandra, but let me just start by saying that I think we have 3 main responsibilities as journalists, and we can start discussing the role of journalism in 2020. The first and most important one is that we have to report reality as it is, not as we wish it would be. And that's very basic. If something's red, we say red. If 70 people die, we say 70. Okay, but once we cover that, and I do believe that a journalist from Venezuela or Argentina, Mexico, the United States, France, and Spain can more or less cover an event the same way if they follow this idea that you just have to report reality as it is, not as you wish it would be. Okay. The second most important social responsibility that we have is to challenge and to question those who are in power. And if we don't do that, then we are not doing our job as journalists. So it is not the same to interview a dictator like Nicolás Maduro, like Fidel Castro, like Hugo Chavez, like Pinochet, than to interview a victim of his dictatorship. It is completely different. And our job is to ask tough questions. And whenever I go to an interview with someone powerful, I always have 2 things in mind. The first one is that if I don't ask that question, no one else is going to do it. And the second one is that I am assuming that I would never talk to that person again. Therefore, I'm not hoping for access afterward. And then it's going to be a completely different interview with much more freedom. About last year, I went to Venezuela to talk to Nicolás Maduro. And I never expected that I was going to talk to him afterwards. It gives you complete freedom. So going back to your question, Sandra, no, I am not an activist. I'm just a journalist who asks questions. And sometimes, and I know that this might be controversial in certain schools of journalism, sometimes as a journalist, you have to take a stand. The idea that journalists always have to be neutral and objective doesn't work when it comes to 6 issues. I think you have to take a stand as a journalist when it comes to racism, discrimination, corruption, public lies, the violation of human rights, and dictatorships. In these instances, in these 6 instances, as a journalist, you have to take a stand. If someone makes a racist remark or a sexist remark, or someone likes, like President Trump, should we remain neutral? I don't think that our role as a journalist is to remain neutral in those cases. When you see cases of racism and discrimination, the violation of human rights, can you just simply report about it and do nothing about it? Shouldn't we challenge those who are perpetrating those violations of human rights? I think that's our role. So many people are saying, well, if you do that, then you're becoming an activist. No, what I'm saying is that if you do that, then you are fully a journalist. That's exactly our role as journalists. The role for a doctor is to save lives. The function for architects and engineers is to build beautiful structures. Our role is to ask tough questions, because if we don't do it, then who's going to do it? So finally, no, I am not an activist. I'm just a journalist who asks questions.
All right, thanks for that. We have a sort of follow-up from my colleague, Adrian Russell, just asking whether or not, so you've sort of laid out this important vision of what journalists' responsibilities are. And she's asking, to what extent has your thinking about this issue about the role of journalists changed over the past 4 years, like in the face of what's going on with the Trump administration in the US?
Well, as many journalists, I think, let me be very honest, I think things changed dramatically in the United States with Donald Trump. We never expected to find a nostalgic nationalist as Donald Trump, an authoritarian figure like Donald Trump, someone who's made racist remarks like Donald Trump, sexist remarks like Donald Trump. Just not only from the Access Hollywood tapes that we saw in 2015 and 2016, but also by calling a monster to the candidate for vice president from the Democratic Party. So, look, as a journalist coming from Latin America, we've been trained with caudillos. We've been trained with strongmen. We've been trained with people who abuse their powers. I can tell you from my own experience. I lived in Mexico for many, many years. And in Mexico from 1929 to the year 2000, we had La Dictadura Perfecta. We had the same party, the PRI, deciding who was going to be the president. And elections didn't matter. It was a fraud after fraud, corruption after corruption. So we've been trained for that. We saw the dictatorships in Argentina and Chile. I saw what happened with Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. So we've been trained to deal with authoritarian figures. And that's exactly what we have here in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that the United States could become a dictatorship. I don't believe that. I think maybe it's my immigrant spirit. But I do think that the democratic system in the United States will prevail. We still have a very strong Congress. We still have a very strong Supreme Court. We have a military that does not get involved in politics. We have incredibly strong journalists questioning those who are in power. So I don't think that the United States could become a dictatorship. Absolutely not. That's impossible from my point of view. However, we have to deal with a new figure in power, which is Donald Trump, who's been abusing his power. And finally, going back to the question, yes, I think the last 4 years, for many journalists in the United States, things have changed dramatically. People who, we have to be very honest here, people normalize Trump's behavior right from the beginning. And they thought, well, he's the president, he can do whatever he wants. No, that is not the case. And we've seen broadcast journalists, we've seen networks, we've seen TV stations, we've seen newspapers changing their point of view simply because of Donald Trump. I mean, we know what these authoritarian governments look like in Latin America. We never saw something similar here in this country.
Okay. Yes, and I'm just going on a particular point that just Adriana Otañez just asked, and I think that's just like very, very smart as she is. And this is, what is your perspective on stories that say Trump personality style appeals to Latino men as machismo? Is that perpetuation of stereotypes, or do you think it holds some truth?
Yeah, of course, el machismo is present here, no? Of course, we're used to talk about machismo in Mexico and Latin America, but not here in the United States. And of course, you see machismo with President Trump. Of course, you see that. And it is not a coincidence that when you see the polls, that more men tend to vote for Donald Trump than women. When you see the Access Hollywood tape and you see that that he thinks that he can behave with women in a certain way simply because he's a star, or when he says that that Kamala Harris is a monster, we simply cannot normalize that kind of behavior. And the same way that we have institutional racism in the United States, we have machismo that is present in this campaign. There's no question about that. But just see the numbers, Sandra. You will see that even within the Hispanic community, I was seeing a poll just yesterday on that. Even within the Hispanic community, more Latino men tend to vote for Donald Trump than women. And also, look, when we were talking about the shy Trumpers, people that don't feel comfortable defending Donald Trump and saying that they're going to vote for Donald Trump, who's going to feel comfortable at home or in your workplace or with your friends defending someone who's made racist remarks, who's made sexist remarks, who's been lying so much that we don't even count the lies that he's made. So of course people feel uncomfortable with that. So the question for many Latinos is, should I vote for someone who's done that? The truth is that the issue of racism and discrimination might not be as important for certain voters. We saw what happened in the last election when Donald Trump got 28% of the Hispanic vote. And why is that? Well, because for some people, immigration is not the most important issue. Because for some people, the economy is more important. Because for some people, Trump's position on Cuba and Venezuela is more important than racism and immigration. So going back to your question again, Sandra, yes, the machismo is present in this campaign, and you can see it in the polls.
Jorge, following up on that, we have a question from a student who writes, as a young Latina student journalist, what advice do you have for Latinx journalists entering a primarily white workspace, especially when dealing with discrimination and racism, or even invalidation of their credibility?
I'm glad that she's using the term Latinx because many people don't feel very comfortable with that. As a matter of fact, I just saw a poll recently that says only 3% of Latinos feel comfortable with Latinx, but it's a beautiful term, and it's a great term that I use it more and more because it includes many groups that were not included before when we were saying Latinos or Hispanics. We were baptized by Richard Nixon in the 70s, and it was the term Hispanic was used for the first time in the 1980 census. And when I arrived in this country in the 1980s, it was very easy because when you were talking about Latinos or Hispanics, you were talking about Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, and Puerto Ricans, and that's it. But now, because whenever there's a crisis in Latin America, the immigration changes here, and because of the changes of the law in 1965 that were instrumental in the diversification of the United States, then we have a Latino community that is not monolithic. But this is the context. Her question is incredibly important. What should we do as a Latino journalist or as a Latinx journalist nowadays? It is not easy to be, again, in traditional media markets. However, what you have right now is something that we never had in the past, which is social media. In other words, you have your own network, you have your own platforms. And let me give you an example. Every day I do Noticiero Univision News, and we have about 2 million viewers every single day, okay? But if there's something happening right now, if there's a breaking news, or if I have an interview, or you have an opinion or something that I would like to communicate, I can go directly to my accounts on Twitter and on Facebook, on Instagram, and I can find immediately maybe 6 or 7 million people who might be reached through those platforms. The question is, what should we do? Should I wait until the newscast at 6:30, or should I just post it on social media right now? When I'm going to colleges and high schools, I tell the students, look at me, but really look at me because I am a dinosaur, and I am. If what I'm asking for people to do every single day is to watch a newscast at a certain time on TV, on traditional TV. So if you tune in 1 minute before, I am not there. And if you tune in 31 minutes later, I am not there either. That's being a dinosaur. And I'm completely convinced that if I didn't have presence on social media, that I wouldn't have my job. So my answer to you is use your voice. Don't be afraid to use your voice. And remember, we are in the middle of a pandemic. And this might be the most important story of our lifetime. So use your voice, write about it, report about it. This is a story that is right in front of you. I mean, once we finish this event, you just open the door and the story, this pandemic is right in front of you. So use your voice, use your platform, don't be afraid. And yes, it is a matter of representation, because the same thing that is happening in the US Senate, we are Latinos, about 20% of the Hispanic, of the total population. But we only have 4 senators. We should have 20 senators. The same thing is happening in Silicon Valley. The same is happening in Hollywood. The same is happening in mainstream media.
Okay, thank you. I was supposed to ask another question, but then I'm just thinking about these. And I was thinking about the future of journalists. And we have many students in journalism that just have asked some questions. And I was just thinking, not only for Latino, Latina, Latinos, Latinas, but what's the future of journalists? Like for these young students who just keep asking, and just this context, which is like really the story of the lifetime. Should they just start writing down whatever they are living with the pandemics, or should they just take a stand? Or how could they change the meaning of journalism? And then I'll just ask whatever I have to ask, but thank you.
It is, let me tell you something. It is the most beautiful profession in the world. It gives you all the opportunities in the world. I mean, I've traveled all around the world. I've met the most interesting people that I can think of. When I decided to be a journalist, I wanted to go to places where history was being made and to get to know and talk to the people changing history. And that's what I've done. So it's been a wonderful, fantastic, fulfilling life. And to be a journalist gives you two things that no other profession can give you. It keeps you young all the time, and it forces you to be a rebel, because going back to my concept of journalism, the most important social responsibility that we have is to challenge those who are in power. In Spanish, Sandra, we have a beautiful word, contrapoder. And you're gonna have, and Matt and Sandra, you're gonna have to help me with the translation, because I don't think there's really a translation for that. We as journalists, we have to be contrapoder. Contra is against, and poder is power.
Like
So
counterpower?
And still is not as strong as contrapoder, because our role, our place is to be exactly on the other side of power and to question those who are in power. So our role is to be contrapoder, and this is incredibly important, because this is where we have to be. If you are too close to power, if you go to a los bautizos y a las bodas de los poderosos, no? To the weddings and baptisms, if you go to their parties, if you laugh at their chistes, if you are part of the power structure, that is not the role of journalism. We have to be on the other side of power, always on the other side of power. And for instance, in Mexico, we had a very interesting experience with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was elected 2 years ago. Many people voted for López Obrador, and many journalists like me, that I criticized the PRI, that I criticized fiercely, criticized Felipe Calderón and his lucha contra el narco, and then Enrique Peña Nieto, who I called probably one of the worst presidents in Mexican history. López Obrador and his followers, they expected us to be with López Obrador, to embrace López Obrador, not to put a distance. And that would have been a mistake. I mean, the same way that I've criticized López Portillo and Cedillo and Salinas and now Calderón and Peña Nieto, is exactly the same way that I should be doing with López Obrador. It is not just because someone is fighting against corruption, as López Obrador is doing. We have to be on his side. As a matter of fact, our role is to always be on the opposite side. So let's make an exercise. Let's suppose that Trump loses the election. I mean, I've been criticizing Donald Trump since day one, even before that, okay? So let's suppose that Joe Biden wins. Then what should I do? What should we do as journalists? Should we just say, okay, it is not Trump, Mr. Biden, welcome, and then start asking easy questions, soft questions, like how's the weather and what are you gonna do with this? And no. I mean, we have to be really, really strong with Joe Biden the same way that we were with Donald Trump. So answering that question, Sandra, our role is to be contrapoder, to be on the other side of power. It doesn't matter who is in power. And if we do that, ethically and morally, we'll always be okay.
So we have a question from a student here at the University of Washington who asks you, Jorge, why do you believe that people have normalized Trump's behavior?
Well, some people were afraid. Some people wanted access to power. Let me give you an example of what happened on that event with Donald Trump. That it's a great example of normalizing things. When Trump said that Mexican immigrants were criminals and rapists, I am a Mexican immigrant. So I did what any one of you would have done. I wrote him a letter. Actually, nobody writes letters anymore, but that was the only way for me to reach him. So I wrote him a handwritten note, put it on a FedEx pack, and sent it to New York. The day after, instead of answering me, Donald Trump published my note with my cell phone number on it. I realized that because I started getting hundreds and hundreds of calls and texts from people who I didn't know. And of course, at the end, I had to change my telephone and I had to change my number. So at that point, Matt, I said, I have to confront Donald Trump. I mean, he had made a racist remark, a deeply important racist remark, and nobody was questioning him about that. So I found out, I don't know if many of you have been to Dubuque, Iowa. I bet not many of you have been there, but I realized that he was gonna be campaigning in Dubuque, Iowa, not in New York City. I expected that not a lot of journalists were gonna go to Dubuque, Iowa, and I went to Iowa to confront him in that press conference. So as it happens in many press conferences, I didn't wait for my turn. I noticed that there was a pause in his speech. I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Trump, I have a question about immigration. He didn't like it. No, he said, I didn't call you. Well, look, as journalists, I was talking about being a rebel. As a journalist, you don't ask for those in power to give you permission to talk or to ask questions. So that's exactly what I did. And then he told me, go back to Univision. It was really an insult. What he was saying is, go back to Mexico. That's what he really meant. Later, he said that he didn't know me. So how come he knew that I was working for Univision? But anyway, it really doesn't matter. So when I left the room, there were about 30 journalists who stayed in that room. And only two, Matt, Tom Llamas and Casey Hunt from MSNBC, Tom Llamas from ABC, only those two journalists challenged Donald Trump and told him, Mr. Trump, you cannot do what you just did. You cannot expel a journalist from a press conference in the United States. But the other 20-something journalists, Matt, they normalized his behavior. They raised their hands. They were well-behaved because they wanted access to him. And that's what happened. And we said, look, this is very dangerous. He's attacking a journalist. He's going against press freedom in this country. This is not part of what a democracy should look like. But the same way that those 20-something journalists normalized his behavior, they kept on normalizing his behavior on TV and when they were writing their stories. And at the end, it was way, way too late.
Well, I have a question which is linked to this one and the other one. It's from Carolina Castellanos from the Universidad. And then she asks, how can you be on the other side of power, contrapoder, as a precarious journalist? Meaning violence, meaning low income, meaning all these layoffs that have been going around. How to become a contrapoder?
Because the other option is, because it's not a possibility. It's not an option. I mean, if you wanna work for those in power, be a politician, be an activist, be part of a political party. But if you wanna work for a president, if you wanna work for a governor, if you wanna work for el alcalde, then that's not your role as a journalist. Our role is to be on the other side of power, to challenge power, to say no. The word no is one of the most powerful words in the world. And everything changes with that word. So if you're not willing to be contrapoder, regardless of where you are, then choose another profession. I do understand that it is incredibly difficult to be a journalist, and it is probably, look, some of the most brave reporters that I know work in Mexico. And I know that I can challenge those who are in power and then go to the supermarket, take a bike ride, and nothing's gonna happen to me. No one is gonna kill me. But if you are in Sinaloa right now, or in Guerrero, or in Oaxaca, and you challenge the mayor, and you challenge the governor, and if you challenge el narco, you could be killed. Not only you could be killed, but you will be killed. And Sandra, you know, we have the numbers. Dozens and dozens of journalists in Mexico have been killed in the last decade. for challenging power. And one of the most dangerous jobs right now in the world is to be a journalist in Mexico. So I get that. I do get that. There are many ways in which we can report about what's happening without putting your life in danger, like reporting without using your real name, using websites, using the protection of international organizations. But this is a dangerous job. It is not easy. I wouldn't ask you to risk your life if you're in Mexico right now by reporting a story, but the true meaning of being a reporter is to challenge those who are in power, and that's what we have to do. And I do understand, Sandra, that it is much easier for me from my house in Miami to say that than for a journalist in Guerrero or Sinaloa or Oaxaca right now to do exactly the same thing. But that's the role of our job. And I do understand that sometimes it is an impossible job. And when it becomes an impossible job, I'm not asking you to risk your life to report a story, because no story is worth the life of a journalist. But that is what we do. We question those who are in power. And if you're not willing to do that, then it's better to go somewhere else. Look, when I left Mexico in 1983, I didn't want to be a censored journalist. And I didn't want to stay in Mexico working for a television network who was not going to give me the freedom to report whatever I wanted. So that's when I decided it was the most difficult decision of my life. I left Mexico City and go to Los Angeles. But I remember that I just didn't want to be a censored journalist. And that's when I left Mexico.
So Jorge, to follow up on that, we've gotten a couple versions of a similar question, which is about the difference or lack thereof in election coverage in 2016 versus 2020. Is it better? Is it different? Or are
it's
we
better.
making some of the same mistakes?
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen, Matt, but it is different. It is better. In 2016, every Trump rally was covered live by CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. You would expect Fox News to do that, but MSNBC and CNN. So the big difference that you see right now is that if there's a Trump rally, Fox News might cover it, MSNBC might report about it, but not cover it live, and CNN exactly the same thing. We are fact-checking Donald Trump live constantly all the time, something that we just didn't do in the past. And yesterday, I don't know if you had the opportunity to see the interview with 60 Minutes with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. Kamala Harris was asked, do you think that Trump is a racist? And she said, absolutely yes. So 4 years ago, many people didn't feel comfortable calling a candidate racist. Things are changing, and we are calling things by their name. And right now, I sense that many more journalists are willing to be contrapoder, are willing to be on the other side of power, are willing to challenge Trump instead of hoping for access to the White House. I think that's the big difference. And since we are in the middle of the pandemic, we have to be incredibly critical of a president who's miserably failed in his response to the pandemic. When we have 220,000 people dying, when you have 80,000 cases a day, when you have more than 8 million people infected by the virus, something's clearly wrong. I mean, something's clearly done a horrible job as a president, and we have to say that. And that's the big difference between today and 2016.
Okay. I think we have enough questions now that we can ask so that we can respect the time that was scheduled. So I'll just ask you if you have other questions, like this is the moment. And so we'll ask the 8 questions we already have, and then see if we have the room of others. So we're stopping at the Jorge Bonilla last one, who has 2 questions. I will just pick one. And then I'll just go into this Thomas Legler, who's also a faculty of the Ibero, who asked.
And I promise to answer shorter.
Okay, a number of CNN, which is like related. Okay, no worries. A number of CNN journalists used to criticize Obama during his presidency incessantly, to the extent that I stopped watching CNN in those years because it seemed to be a lighter version of Fox. Then CNN switched its editorial line, and its journalists have spent almost 4 years criticizing Trump. Is this contraproductive work, or what is the story behind CNN's behavior?
Well, I couldn't speak for CNN, but I do see a change in CNN and on MSNBC and on many other media outlets and websites. I think, just to be fair, when Barack Obama was president, I told him that I criticized him a lot because he deported more than 3 million undocumented immigrants. And also because he didn't keep his promise. He told me that he was going to send a legislation, he was going to send a bill to Congress to legalize 11 million undocumented immigrants. And he never did it, not even in 2009 when he controlled the White House and both chambers of Congress. So it is, again, our responsibility to challenge those who are in power. It doesn't matter if it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump or whoever wins the election. It is our responsibility. If we don't do it, then who's going to do it? So Joe Biden, in the same way that I think he has to learn a lesson from López Obrador. If he wins, and we don't know, I would never bet against Donald Trump. We always make a mistake when we make bets. But he has to understand that if he wins, the press that right now is criticizing Donald Trump is going to change. And it doesn't mean that they're going to be supporting him all the time.
Jorge, one of the questions that we've gotten from students sort of prior to the event is just about, what the work is behind the scenes for you before you do an interview with an important political figure. So can you give us a little bit of the backstage of, what do you have to do before you, sit down for an interview with Joe Biden like you did recently?
Yeah, you just have to know about them more than they do. And you're going to say, well, that's simply impossible. You have to do your homework up to a point when you feel incredibly comfortable asking him about all the things. Now, and you have to find the weaknesses, the contradictions in the interviewee. That I'll give you a couple of examples. Joe Biden's been criticizing Trump's immigration policy, but I found a picture taken in 2014 in which that showed an 8-year-old Honduran boy in a cage in a detention center in Texas. It happened during the Obama-Biden administration. It's something that I knew that Joe Biden didn't know. So that's the kind of research and information that you have to have before an interview. And also, I needed to challenge Joe Biden on the fact that he was vice president when President Obama deported 3 million undocumented immigrants. What did he do? Did he stop that policy? Did he complain about that policy? What did he do? How come Obama had promised to introduce immigration reform? And what was the role of that vice president doing that? So it is, again, we have to do our homework more than, and we have to know about that person more than any other person. I'm finishing a book on Venezuela, on Nicolás Maduro. I went to talk to him last year, and let me show you my homework. I read all these papers before my interview with Maduro. I mean, I became an expert on Venezuelan constitution. I became an expert on human rights violations in Venezuela. I became an expert on how you elect a president. So I became an expert with names and last names of the people that were deported. I had a list of 400 political prisoners in Venezuela. So I knew that I wasn't going to have the opportunity to interview another dictator pretty soon. So you just have to take advantage of that. And one final thing. The worst thing that could happen to an interviewer is to end the interview and realize, chin, I didn't ask that question. And believe me, you know that question. You know that there's always one or two questions that you have to ask. And if you don't ask that question, you feel terrible, and it's the worst feeling. So when your palms start sweating and your heart starts racing, and you don't know if you should ask that question, that's precisely the question that you have to ask. That's exactly the question that you have to ask. It doesn't matter if you don't, they're going to hate it. They're going to hate you. You'll never have access to that person again, but it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. So you won't have the opportunity to talk to people with power a lot. It doesn't matter, but you might have one or two opportunities, so use them. Now, can I say something? Some students, this is important. Don't be a kamikaze, okay? Also, I mean, you don't have to be a rebel all the time for every single story. It happens very rarely when you have the opportunity to talk with someone in power. So if you're in the newsroom and the news director or your boss asked you to cover a crash or a hurricane, you don't have to be a rebel for that, okay? You can just report reality, tell me what happened, why it happened, who did it, and that's it, okay? So it doesn't, there's an expression, Matt, and you're gonna have to help me with it. You don't have to go to the mat for every story. Is that the expression?
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have to do that, okay? Because they're gonna fire you. I mean, if you are challenging every single source, it's not the way it is. But you have to find out when it really matters.
Sandra?
Sure, I'm just grabbing all other questions, and I was thinking two or three about immigrants.
Yeah.
So the first one is, what's the difference between Biden and Trump, particularly on immigrants? And then as a journalist, how to deal with illegal immigrants? Like
Well,
how to cover them?
Yeah, the first is that I would never call them illegal immigrants. I would.
Okay. That's exactly the question.
Yeah, I mean, no human being is illegal. No human being is illegal. And then that's the kind of language used by Trump and his supporters. So the difference is that Donald Trump has been the most anti-immigrant president since the 1950s. Joe Biden, in the past presidential debate, he recognized that they made a big mistake by deporting more than 3 million. And he promised that within 100 days, he's going to introduce a bill to Congress to legalize those 11 million. So the difference is enormous. Donald Trump has changed the way you request political asylum in the United States. And there are thousands of immigrants from Central America waiting on the Mexican side right now. That's going to be changed. We have to remember that Trump introduced a Muslim ban. If you are from the majority Muslim countries, you cannot come into the United States. And the number of immigrants arriving in this country on a yearly basis has decreased from about 1 million every year to about 600,000. So it has consequences. Elections have consequences. And most of the time, the most vulnerable are the most affected.
Jorge, I know we're running out of time, so I want to leave a minute if there's anything that you want to leave us with, sort of, for everything you've already shared with us. Thank you 1,000 times over for both your insights and your wisdom. But is there any sort of last thoughts that, for students or for faculty, for any of us?
Well, I think I've emphasized enough the importance of challenging those who are in power. But let me just summarize a little bit my philosophy when it comes to the role of journalism. I do think that we have to report reality as it is, not as we wish it would be. And so that's one important thing, and the importance of challenging and questioning those who are in power. But because of the pandemic, I've been thinking that there's a third role. And if we do our job correctly, we can save lives. So I think I do understand journalism as a public service, from reporting to challenging those who are in power to saving lives. And if we do our job correctly when it comes to reporting about the pandemic, about the masks, about the politicians who don't follow their own rules, about politicians who have failed in responding to this pandemic, I think we can save lives. And it's an incredibly important responsibility that we have. So just by reporting on the importance of using masks, on how this pandemic is being transmitted, how you get infected, by challenging those who are in positions of power and who don't give you the right information, I think we can save lives. So it is our role to report reality, to challenge power, and to save lives with the right information.
It's hard to do any better than that. Please.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it, and this is we'll always remember 2020, and as if you're journalism students, please take advantage of this. I know it feels horrible being where you are and where I am. I mean, we cannot go anywhere. But if you are a true journalist, remember that the most important story of our lifetime is right in front of you. It's right there. Report about it. Use the platforms. Use the social media. Use your voice. Speak up. That's what we do. To be a journalist is not a job for those who want to be invisible and those who want to be silent. It is not for you. I mean, if you want to be silent, I respect that. But then journalism is not for you. Speak up, use your voice. And remember that you have a perspective that nobody else has. If you can use that perspective, that's the way to find your voice. And that's the best way to be a journalist, I think.
Jorge, on behalf of everybody at the University of Washington and also Ibero, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your thoughts, and thank you to everybody for coming and asking such great questions. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of everyone, thank you. Have a nice day.
En la Ibero, gracias por escucharme y hagan preguntas duras, por favor, a todos. ¿Ok? Así que, gracias.